Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here, and today I am talking about Facebook groups because I'm asking the question, would shutting down Facebook groups make the world a better place? Now, hear me out, and I bring this up because I recently read a really interesting article on Facebook groups, but I want to actually premise this with something that happened in the past, and that is the shutting down of many comment sections that we have seen over the years on basically from many news organizations, because they shut those down on their websites due to just the insane amount of anger and vitriol from anonymous users they were seeing, and it really wasn't that effective for them to have those running. Now, take the case of NPR, National Public Radio, here in the United States. They killed their comment section in August of 2016. And if you look at their stats, it's really telling. The last full month they had, July of 2016, NPR.org recorded almost 33 million unique users and 491,000 comments on their comment section. But those comments came from just 19,400 commenters, and that is 0.06% of all users commenting. That basically was a number that was steady and consistent throughout the year of 2016. So you have 19,000 people just basically going off on tangents, saying just some very angry things. And so NPR said, this is really not benefiting the 33 million users that we have unique every month. And so here we are, that very, very small minority of just pure anger and hatred and whatever to complain for complaint's sake or insult other people or go off on political tangents is what we see. Anonymity is a really serious thing, and as we've seen, basically this deeper political divide, thanks in no small part to disinformation campaigns designed to drive wedges into our society, these commenters have migrated from the comment section of various sites, but Facebook groups remains one of the worst offenders for bringing extremists together, as we just witnessed in the 2020 US election. Now for this interesting article from The Guardian, and I bring this up because Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO, announced last week that Facebook will no longer algorithmically recommend political groups to users in an attempt to, quote, turn down the temperature on online divisiveness. But experts are saying that such policies are difficult to enforce, much less quantify, and the toxic legacy of groups basically featuring in these algorithmic incentives is going to be very difficult to erase. According to Jessica Gonzalez, who is the co-founder of the anti-hate speech group Change in Terms, and I quote, "This is like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. It doesn't do enough to combat the long history of abuse that's been allowed to fester on Facebook." Now, the original intent of Facebook groups wasn't to be an online gathering place for this kind of content, and I will get to my own thoughts on Facebook in a minute, specifically Facebook groups. In a blog post in 2017 to underscore that, in 2017, Zuckerberg basically called, the blog post was called Building Global Community. Zuckerberg argued that there was, quote, a real opportunity through groups to, quote, create meaningful social infrastructure in our lives. More than 1 billion people are active members of Facebook groups, but most don't seek out groups on their own. Friends send invites or Facebook suggests them. If we can improve our suggestions and help connect 1 billion people with meaningful communities, that can strengthen our social fabric. That's what Zuckerberg was going after in 2017, aside from doing this so he could probably further data mine you as you spill your guts out to the group, etc., etc. Now, the fast rise, though, of these groups in 2020, I think in part thanks to the pandemic as well as the election cycle, came with almost no oversight and proved to be really messy as it expanded. In shifting its focus to groups, Facebook began to rely more heavily on unpaid moderators to police hate speech on their platforms. Groups proved a more private place to speak for conspiracy theories, so basically they started to proliferate, and essentially some organizers on Facebook started to organize real-life violence, again, with almost no oversight from expert moderators or expert researchers and all of that. There's no oversight to this. So Facebook then introduced a number of new rules earlier in 2020 after this started to explode to, quote, keep Facebook groups safe, including new consequences for individuals who violate rules and increased responsibility given to the admins of groups to keep their users in line. The company said that it hired 35,000 people to address safety on Facebook, including engineers, moderators, subject matter experts, and they also invested in AI technology to spot posts that violate guidelines. They've really turned that up for just saying some very basic things on Facebook in terms of insults. I've actually been seeing people get banned. So they are trying to really work on this. Researchers have long complained that little is shared publicly regarding how exactly Facebook algorithms work, though, and basically what is being shared on a platform and what information Facebook collects on users is essentially unknown. The increased popularity of groups on top of that made it even more difficult to keep track of activity online for researchers and moderators. So that is obviously a very serious problem. And meanwhile, the platform's algorithmic recommendations are basically grabbing users and sucking them further down that rabbit hole. Little is known exactly how Facebook algorithms work, but what is clear is that the platform recommends users join similar groups to the ones that they are already in based on keywords and shared interests. Facebook's own researchers found, and I quote, that 64% of all extremist group joins are due to our recommendation tools. And that was an internal report from 2016 when there was only 20 million to 100 million people. Now there's over 600 million people in Facebook groups. That is obviously a growing problem. And once again, to quote Ms. Gonzalez, quote, Facebook has let white supremacists organize and conspiracy theorists organize all over its platform and has failed to contain the problem. In fact, it has significantly contributed to the spread of that problem through its recommendation system, and I will get to that as well. Now, this past Sunday, the Wall Street Journal reported that internal documents showed executives were aware of the risks posed by groups and were warned repeatedly by researchers to address them. In one presentation in 2020, in August, researchers said, quote, roughly 70% of the top 100 most active U.S. civic groups are considered non-recommendable for issues such as hate, misinformation, bullying, and harassment. And to quote the researchers, we need to do something to stop these conversations from happening and growing as quickly as they do. That's according to the Wall Street Journal, and they suggested taking measures to slow the growth of groups until more could be done to actually address these issues. Several months later on in 2020, Facebook then halted algorithmic recommendations for political groups ahead of the U.S. election. That's a move that they've extended basically indefinitely with a policy that they just announced last week. Now, this change seems to be motivated by the January 6th insurrection, if you will, or the riot, or whatever you want to call that, the Capitol breach. And basically, the FBI found many ties to organizing on Facebook. It wasn't just Parler. Parler gets the focus because that's where a lot of this has migrated, and we'll talk about Parler in a bit. But that's what we're talking about here. So my question then is, would shutting all of this mess down just make sense? And honestly, I don't think so. I really don't, because there are plenty of legitimate groups out there that discuss all kinds of things that are innocuous to political or civic engagement, whether that's extremist or whatever. Some, major media personalities, businesses have groups to help cultivate followings or interact with their users and all of that. And that basically can devolve into the NPR comment section with screw you kind of stuff. But it also gives people the ability to engage with each other, I think, in very legitimate ways. But it definitely appears that better policing is needing. Now, I did a recent video on Facebook groups about actual war crimes that were happening in Facebook groups where stolen art from war zones was being sold. That is a war crime. Because these groups are primarily speaking in Arabic, Facebook has not been able to police it because they don't have enough Arabic speakers to know that basically art illegally is being sold, aka tantamount to a war crime. Then there's Parler. let's talk about Parler, because Parler is basically priding themselves on not policing anything, which has basically invited the extremist side to essentially move there before they got shut down in their process of getting spun back up. I've done videos on that. I wrote an article on that about the interesting Russian connection there. Go check that out. But Parler, if you didn't know, just ousted their CEO because he wanted to police extremist posts and content. And the executive board for Parler wasn't having it. So what do they do about that? I mean, that's the thing. I think their CEO is afraid of Parler being sued, something that would definitely happen if Section 230 was repealed or killed, which I don't think is basically going to happen because the FCC, the new head of the FCC, is essentially friendly to that. But we have to do something about this. And I think this goes above and beyond the issue of censorship and all of that. And I've gone back to a specific thing. Now, there was a Supreme Court ruling where the Supreme Court basically said you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. And the example they use is essentially you cannot basically have speech that intends to cause harm. The problem that we have there is that you translate that into actually, yes, we can yell fire in a crowded theater if there's an actual fire. So what they are talking about is we can't lie. Meaning free speech doesn't necessarily protect a lie that has intent to do harm. And if we are sitting in a Facebook group saying we're going to coordinate so that we can go harm somebody, kill somebody, breach something, burn something down, whatever that is, you are now exhausting or expanding what is essentially considered free speech. Hate speech is an entirely different thing. What is or is not considered that? I think is a debate for scholars and all of that. Everybody's got an opinion on that. But when it comes down to intent for a crime, I think we've got a serious issue here. And so where is that line? I honestly don't know. I honestly couldn't tell you. I have friends that believe on both sides of the political spectrum, whatever it is they believe, and that's fine. Here I am stuck in the middle with you. But this is something that we need to address. And what happens when they decide to go off of Facebook and move somewhere where they can't really be tracked, can't really be monitored, when some of these, quite frankly, law enforcement needs to monitor because they will do harm? It's a mess right now, and I don't know how we necessarily recover from this, but killing this would potentially kill small business that are cultivating, let's say, these Facebook groups because it's revenue for them, or there's legitimate conversation. You can have a Facebook group on history and talk about, the specifics of history without, hopefully devolving into name calling and shouting. And I'm not talking about name calling and shouting. I'm called an idiot every day on social media as soon as I publish one of these videos, as I'm sure will happen here on one of the various platforms in some way, shape, or form. I'm talking about intent. And I think that is something that we need to really look at. And so I leave it up to you. I think this is interesting news. Facebook is clamping down on this by simply cutting the algorithm. But at this point, and to the original point too, Facebook said that they're primarily, before the algorithm, friends were inviting friends. And so if you've got a friend that's, anything from totally innocuous to an extremist that says, hey, come join my group, is that a way to recruit? And how are we blocking that? Can we block that? Apparently, this is very highly unmanageable, as Facebook has proven consistently over and over and over again that they have no management on their back end, whether it's not knowing who has just ripped data out of there for data mining purposes. I've done videos and talks on that, to things like where people are going and what they're doing. So beyond the keywords or characteristics they need for data mining so that they can sell your information to advertisers, it is pretty Wild West out there, and now everything that they are doing is simply trying to put out a fire that is raging out of control. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but that is your news of the day. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP, and please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe and stay online. Thanks, everyone.